Welcome to Behind the Binary, the podcast that introduces you to the fascinating people, technology, and tools driving the world of reverse engineering. I'm your host, Josh Stroschein, a reverse engineer at the Flare team at Google. In this episode, we're sitting down with Nick Harbour, a reverse engineer with the Flare team, to discuss his career journey from his early days in the Air Force to his work at Mandiant. He shares insights into the evolution of malware and digital forensics, his contributions to the field of malware analysis, and the development of the Flare-On contest, a reverse engineering challenge. Get ready for an insightful conversation that will shed light on the hidden layers of technology and take you into the world of reverse engineering. Welcome, Nick, to the inaugural episode of the podcast. It's great that you're here. Why don't we get started by learning a little bit more about your background? What got you interested in reverse engineering in the first place?
Great. Thanks, Josh. It's nice to be here. It started for me, I joined the Air Force right out of high school, so very early. I joined when I was 17. You needed to get your parents' permission, and you get to pick your job. You know, my dad was a recruiter, so I kind of knew how the whole system worked and could game it a little bit. So the job I picked was computer programmer, which, you know, it was 1998. You know, the .com boom was still happening. This is a good long-term prospect, and I was right. It's panned out fairly well. So I joined as a computer programmer. You kind of go off, do the basic training, then you go to the school where they teach you how to be a programmer for a little bit. I guess it'd be the equivalent of a coding boot camp nowadays. But then you get your first assignment. Well, while I was there learning in what they call the tech school, the coding boot camp, there was a couple interesting things happened. One interesting thing happened was one of the days of training was just one day where they teach you x86 assembly language. And that was just the coolest day of my whole time there. I just loved it. And as soon as we learned that day, I went home and tried to figure out how I could pirate the MASM assembler. And, you know, what could I do to play around and tinker with this stuff? Because that was just so neat. But the second cool thing that happened was while I was there, some people from Air Force's Office of Special Investigations came to recruit for a position at the newly formed DoD Computer Forensic Lab. And so they interviewed a bunch of people there, and luckily enough, I got the job. So instead of being shipped off to, San Angelo, Texas, in the middle of nowhere, I got to go to the DC area and work in this cool new computer forensic lab. So I didn't know what computer forensics was. I went home, after class and did an Alta Vista search for computer forensics, and nothing came up. So that's both a knock against Alta Vista because you really couldn't find anything with pre-Google search engines, but also it was a completely brand new field at the time, and all of what we consider to be modern, incident response and forensics and all this stuff is all you wouldn't have found any of that public information back in those days. It was all new stuff. So I couldn't find anything about computer forensics, but it sounded cool. They had a good pitch. And so I went to this lab and spent my whole 4 years of the Air Force working in this computer forensic lab. So while I was there, I was initially, as a computer programmer, they wanted you to, they wanted me to learn the forensic trade and everything, but also be able to kind of work my way into research and development, writing forensic tools, and working out on helping out on hard cases that might require special technical skills. So I was kind of chosen to be a special researcher from the beginning, but you had to earn your way in there. It wasn't just granted. So I did. I worked a few forensic cases, and then eventually went into research and development there, and did some interesting things. So while I was in research and development there at the DCFL, that's when I had my first experience of reverse engineering. So one of the special projects that came in was there was a tool that they wanted reverse engineered. It was basically a steganography tool. and it was a DOS tool, so it was like 16-bit. And I remembered I had been tinkering around with assembly language and trying to write programs in assembly from scratch, kind of unsuccessfully at the time, but I had, built up some debugging skills and disassembly skills from that tinkering at home. So I just took a stab at this thing. They were planning to bring in some people from the NSA to reverse engineer it. But I thought, that's going to take them a few weeks to do, maybe a month to get somebody up here. Let me just take my best shot at it. So I basically lived in the lab there for a few days while I beat my head over this tool. In hindsight, it might not have been that complicated, but coming into it with very limited skills, it was quite a feat at the time. So I didn't know that at the time things like IDA Pro existed. Like I said, search engines weren't that good at the time. This was Google was still in beta. I just wasn't able to find much. So I was using a flat text disassembler. So you basically run a disassembler over a program and it prints out, every function or every instruction it can find, just like OBJ dump style. A lot of errors in there. Doesn't know instructions from data very well, so it's very messy. But I used that in a text editor and marked it up and renamed things as much as I could and tried to reverse engineer from just a flat text disassembly and use DOS debug to step through the program and, confirm my suspicions, things like that, and work through this thing. And eventually it came together. I did, after many kind of sleepless nights and days, I figured out the algorithm I was using and wrote a tool to do the inverse of it, so to detect that it was writing data somewhere and then to properly extract it out and decrypt it. And so that was a big aha to prove that your reverse engineering was successful by successfully writing the inverse of what the tool did. It's not only did you have to know how the algorithm worked and get the code right, but you had to think about it logically enough to write the inverse successfully. So I was very proud of myself after that. But it just was in the back of my mind from that point that wouldn't it be cool if I could just do that for a living? That seemed like a pipe dream, something that just wouldn't really happen. This is going to be an occasional thing in my career. I get the opportunity to reverse engineer something. It didn't really seem like something I could really feasibly make a career out of at that point, but how wrong I would be in the long run.
Oh, so that was your hook or your aha moment for reverse engineering then?
Yeah. So I was still very much a forensics person at that time, but I got my first taste, my first hit of being a reverse engineering specialist, and wow, that's cooler than all the other stuff I do put together. So one day, if I can do nothing but that would be great. Another cool thing I did while I was there at forensics was I wrote a tool called DCFLDD, which I think you can still find floating around, and it came on some Linux distributions probably up until very recently. So that was the thing I was known for at least the first 10 years or so of my career. I was the guy who wrote DCFLDD. But anyway, while I was at the DCFL in DoD, we were doing things very traditional disk forensics type focus. So the whole approach was, whether it was a fraud investigation or a computer intrusion, we showed up, we imaged hard drives, and then we did all of our analysis on the back end, just based off of hard drive images and potentially memory images. I had heard the reputation of a guy named Kevin Mandiant floating around because before I got to the lab, he worked a really large intrusion for the DoD. And the person I replaced at the DCFL was actually Kevin's, the person that Kevin kind of wandered around the DoD with. So he took this DCFL resource, and who was a person similar to myself, and together the two of them went from place to place investigating, hopping around the country investigating this really big intrusion. So I had heard this reputation of this guy, and he was kind of a mythical figure. Eventually, he came to our lab and gave me gave a tool demo of some stuff they were working on, and it kind of blew my mind. So his approach to incident response was completely different than what we were doing at the DCFL, and like in a good way. So first off, he had all of these little tools. It was mostly Windows tools, which I hadn't seen like modern Windows forensic tools in a little while at that point. We were doing everything on Linux, but his approach was to run tools to get information from a live running system that didn't involve collecting the whole hard drive, didn't involve collecting the whole memory image, just collect information about the state of the running system and as much data as you can. So he called it live response. And that formed the backbone of his approach to incident response. And he had a team of people at this point that he was going around with from a company called Cytex at the time. So him and a few other people had a little incident response team, and this was their approach. And it was game changing because they were able to show up at an organization that was compromised, and using this live response approach, they were able to march around very, very quickly, following the trail of the investigation, almost at real time, and get to the source of the compromise and get to remediation long before, like if we were investigating it as the DCFL, we would have still been imaging hard drives by the time Kevin Mandiant is already done with the whole thing. So I knew he was on to something at that point, and it was in the back of my mind that this guy might be doing cool things, and in the end I was right. So I just took a segue there to talk about Kevin, because I figured it's one of those things, like if I was a person in like Genghis Khan's army and you're reading a biography of me, like at some point I got to talk about Genghis Khan. So at some point right here I have to bring up Kevin Mandiant, because it's kind of important to the whole picture here. So I did my 4 years in the military, actually got kind of burnt out, sold all my computers, decided I wanted to be a chef, went off to culinary school, got a little weird. At the end of the day, though, computers aren't really that bad of a way to make money, so I did ultimately come back. And I can still cook, though, so I learned a few things.
Yeah. Did you, like, before you got into the Air Force, were you into computers, programming, anything, or was it the Air Force that introduced you to that?
Oh yeah, I was into them pretty early. I think my first it was a 386, but it was like a 16 megahertz system, so I was able to play the original like Doom and stuff like that. So I was into bulletin board systems. My dad and I started a bulletin board system too. And I originally taught myself to program so that I could write what they call door games for bulletin boards, which you log into this little bulletin board where you can like send messages and stuff to other people in your area. And you could typically drop out and play a game like solitaire or maybe a little role-playing game or something like that. But these were very easy to write little pieces of software. And it's kind of like if you were learning to program in the early 2000s, like you would have probably started with HTML. So I started with Quick Basic 4.5, writing door games for, I sold registered copies for like $8 a piece. Didn't make a ton of money, but it was a way to learn programming, and I was very, very passionate about it. So I did have programming experience before I came into the military, which is probably how I ended up getting selected for this very cushy, nice special duty assignment.
Yeah, well, and it sounds like you have one of the ultimate Air Force hacks as well. That is having a parent as a recruiter. I wish I would have had that resource when I first got in, because it would have maybe saved me a little bit of pain learning some Air Force lessons the hard way. Yeah,
the military is kind of what you make of it, and obviously knowing how to work the system the more you know about that, the better experience you can have. So I ended up very lucky there. And I was kind of surprised to hear when I first got to basic, how many people were like hating their recruiter. And I don't know, like, I guess a lot of these people were a little bit unethical and undersold certain aspects and oversold. But my parents were in the military. They met in the Air Force. I lived on Air Force bases most of my life. Like I was a part of it. I kind of knew how things worked to a pretty good degree.
So you got to know Kevin. Obviously you joined Mandiant. So what was what brought you finally to Mandiant and transitioning out of the DoD and the Air Force, and what was it like?
Yeah. So after I kind of came back into computing from my brief foray into being a Luddite, my flirtation with that, I tried to kind of make it in just general software engineering world in the government, like defense contractors, that sort of thing. And then I realized that Kevin had broken away from Cytex and founded a little company called Redcliffe Consulting. And I think one of his teammates there interviewed me for his blog, and it's like made me very curious. And one of the people I was working with at the time was very excited to go, and he was following Kevin around at DEF CON and Black Hat, trying to ultimately get a job at Redcliffe. He did succeed. He was one of the people that came over right before me. But yeah, so it was kind of in that orbit, but Kevin's team at that time was a very small company and they weren't just like massively hiring. So, but I was very attracted because the idea of doing that kind of cool work, this cool incident response work in a private company or, outside of the government seemed really cool, because at the time, there was security work that companies were doing, which was mostly like security operations center work and things like that. And there was clearly some people in like the antivirus industry that I had no exposure to at all. But most of the cool security work, like responding to intrusions and things like that I was aware of, was all in the government. And that comes with its, there's some job stability there if you have a clearance, which is nice. But I was kind of hoping for something a little more flexible and just not government work, to be honest. There's only so much working in a room without windows you can take before you lose your mind. So being able to do incident response as a company is really cool. And it was an untested, now it seems like, of course, you can get a job doing incident response. But at the time, there was no company out there that was selling that as a service, and particularly making it the sole aim of your company to provide incident response. That came from a mentality shift that it seems alien to us now, but a lot of companies, and every time we would get called or we would try to find work, we would run into this wall where companies didn't realize they needed specialized incident response service or needed to invest in that internally. So the way security operations centers and things like that worked back in these days, and we're talking mid 2000s, is companies were very heavily, and they would have security teams, but often the security team, they would probably just be focused on setting up and maintaining firewalls, proxies, AV, and they might have a team of people monitoring alerts, but it's just monitoring, the AV alerts and things from their network sensors, and not really taking any more of a proactive approach past that, and not being capable of handling anything that was more targeted, or their concept of a threat was a virus. So trying to sell me on the idea that you can have malware that's targeting your enterprise that's not a virus, was kind of a hard sell. It seems crazy nowadays, but you can even, I think a lot of the people that were hating us on Twitter back in the day for when we coined the term APT, they probably have not deleted their tweets. So if you can scroll back to like 2009, 2008, you can probably find all the backlash that we suffered from our initial, conference postings and things like this about talking about the APT threat and how this is different than normal threats you face. And people are like, what are you talking about? This is nonsense. Like, antivirus works, this works. And it's crazy to think that was even an argument nowadays. But that's what we faced back in the day is that sort of thought process. So it was a constant battle to change the minds of companies to make them realize that they needed to think about targeted threats facing their environment and not just commodity malware being passed around. And that's where Mandiant fit in, is where a company would get notified by like the FBI or something like that, and they'd be like, they would be shocked. Like, what do you mean I got hit? I'm hit with this hackers. Like, I have AV, we're up to date, we have the latest firewall, we have everything in place. What are you talking about? And so they would pass the reference to us, and we would show up and do our thing, investigating that compromise. And by the end of those engagements, then the company has a good idea of what they're facing. So the return work was always easier, because by that point they've realized that, okay, security is a little bit of a different game than I thought we were playing, and I need to, be able to maybe have some in-house forensics, some in-house malware analysis to be able to handle this stuff to some degree at all. But this is long before things like threat intel feeds and stuff like that, threat hunting, before any of that was around.
What did that early malware look like? Like, what was it commonly written in? What was its primary purposes? Like, what were the objectives of those, whoever was trying to, deploy it or getting it into these environments?
Yeah, so it was a lot easier. So I'd say in general, the average malware sample back in those days was pretty trivial in comparison to what the average thing going around is now, because the antivirus products were not, a lot of them at that point had what they considered to be heuristic detection, but it just was really not very good at all. And so it was still, what was earning most of the money was the signature detection. So they were pretty good at detecting threats that specific malware samples that they had seen before and generated signatures for. But if you just sat down with a C compiler and wrote a quick little backdoor, hit compile, and uploaded it to a Fortune 500 company in 2005, like, that is not going to get detected by anything. Even if you hit the exact set of API calls required to make a reverse shell, things just weren't detecting it at the time. Modern EDR products make that a lot more hard. So you end up seeing a lot more sophisticated malware, or at least malware that's taking some level of anti-EDR or anti-analysis countermeasures built into it. But back in the day, like, the majority of malware we saw was very simple, straightforward executables. There would be a lot of them. So the idea is that sometimes they would get detected, but you would have malware families that we would trace, and over the span of a couple months, we might encounter 200-300 different unique samples of that. They would change a couple things and upload another version of that to the network. So it would just be enough to throw off if you tried to signature by, oh, let me find this hash of this malware on the network. That specific hash might only catch a few samples. The next version of that malware is already deployed, and you don't have that specific hash you're looking for. So you need to develop more sophisticated methods of detection rather than just relying on file names and hashes and stuff like that. So I would say, yeah, back in the day, they were definitely more straightforward malware, and because the cat and mouse game, they were didn't have many hurdles to overcome to avoid detection. People weren't actively looking for them, and the tools weren't very good at finding them, so they didn't need to be much more sophisticated.
Was it still largely Windows? Was that as dominant back then as it is today for like an enterprise deploy or setup?
Yeah, it was. Maybe even more dominant than it is now. That was a big mentality shift for me coming into Mandiant. I was still kind of like a Linux/FreeBSD diehard when I first came over, and everything was just Windows in the IR world. So I pretty much became a Windows exclusive user at that point, because that's just that was my whole world. And yeah, we would get the occasional Unix malware when we get to a server, but your average enterprise was still running, at least back when I started, with like Windows 2000 file servers and things like that. So that's where all, it's the same goes with any kind of IT environment. Once you get sucked into it, you tend to like start running the same OS across everything. So Windows environments were usually fairly exclusively Windows, and so was the malware. The attackers would get domain admin credentials fairly easily and be able to push their malware out using official domain admin tools, and just use the Windows computing environment to their own ends. And nobody was behind the wheel. Nobody was really monitoring things like domain admin use or service account usage. These were fairly common things to audit and monitor nowadays, but in the early Mandiant days, the first thing we would do is show up in an organization and like ask, what are your domain admin accounts? What are your service accounts? Like, give me an actual list. Don't just tell me that, our service accounts are locked. There's nothing there. We want to see the actual list, because it's always the forgotten accounts that the attackers were moving around with. I will give an early IR war story, I think, involving Kevin, and just to kind of paint the picture of how easy and kind of what the adversarial environment was like. A lot of companies, like I said, they didn't have in-house forensics or malware analysis capability, even fairly large, sophisticated companies. Generally, it's the goal of a company to spend as little as possible on computer security, even today. Like any money you're spending on security is not being spent on your actual core business and making money. So it's always it's a give and take, and it takes something like big headline grabbing incidents to make people spend more. So early on, I did a few incidents with Kevin and our team, and I remember this one pretty clearly. I think it's a good illustration. So we show up at this client site. They knew they were compromised. They knew when, and they even had the computer they suspected being the root of the compromise, like the one that had the malware. They saw this machine beaconing out. They knew when they saw it start to beacon out, and it was sitting in the conference room with us. They had brought the computer there, hooked it up, and so they briefed us on the backstory of this system, and they said, okay, here's the system if you want to get started. So it was, like 9 a.m, and Kevin's there, and Kevin was like, well, I'll take the first crack at it, which was a little weird. He was head of the company, and like we have forensic people there and all that, and but Kevin wanted to do it himself. So he jumped over there, got on the system, literally just sorted in case you can like view all the files and sort by most recent. And so the most recently modified executable on the system was a file called svc host with a 0.exe sitting in the Windows directory. And like, that's the malware. And it correlated exactly with the time that they said they had saw the first beacon. So I was like, oh, there it is. And they were just like, mind was blown. Like, wow, you guys are wizards. How did you ever do this? And that's the sort of like big, quick, easy win that you can have when the clients don't have their own malware or forensic support in-house or contracted to. It just like blew their mind that we were able to find the malware so quickly and efficiently. Then it was obviously a lot more work to actually discover the extent of that compromise, but it's just a good example of just how it was shooting fish in the barrel for a lot of those early incidents. The malware didn't have to disguise itself very well. All it had to do was hide itself from, your average system administrator, and it was pretty much good enough to stay active on a system for indefinite periods of time. That client wouldn't have even known that the malware was there and communicating out, except they got notified by the government that this compromise was happening.
Wow.
Yeah. That's why it was part of Kevin's original mission with the company. The idea was there's all these tools and companies that are designed to prevent you from being hacked, or like prevent malware from running on your systems, and everything was focused on prevention. But there was nobody you could call that you could come in and just answer the question, am I currently compromised? Everything was all just prevention. There was nothing that you could do to like answer that question, am I currently compromised? So his big focus on the company and the whole ethos was answering that question, am I currently compromised? It's a very hard question, and one that people, I think it's easier to just ignore and hope. Just assume that you're not compromised and just work from that concept of reality, even though you might be currently compromised, and that compromise might have been going on for 2 years, and a foreign adversary might have just taken all of your most critical business information during that period. So,
do you think that's an easier, just to fast forward now, do you think that's an easier question to answer today? When a company calls and says, are we compromised?
Yeah, I think it is easier to answer because we've been developing, I say we, not just Mandy. Mandy's obviously been developing tools, but the industry has been aware of this problem and has been writing tools to address that problem for the last decade and a half or so. So now you have great tools. If you want to do like forensic analysis across your entire enterprise, you have a spreadsheet of different EDR companies that you need to evaluate and compare and figure out which is the right fit for your organization. Whereas, going back to the beginning of Mandiant, there was no spreadsheet. You didn't have any tools. It was, Kevin Mandiant, his team walking around with CD-ROMs filled with little executables, collecting text files. And like that was how the work was getting done. The tools are so much better now. That's why you're seeing an elevation in the threats, because the easy stuff isn't working for them anymore. So you have to be more sophisticated as an attacker. So yeah, in general, yeah, it's easier. I think it's addressable. We can, there's not just one. For a long time, we were the only company that you could call to do that type of work. And then a few of the other bigger security companies got in the game too. But now, if your company gets compromised, there's a plethora of companies you can call that have the right tools, that have the right expertise, and you're not just like trying to get Mandiant to pick up the phone and trying to haggle them down from their hourly price point. It's like you have options now.
Okay, so it sounds like things are really evolving, and that for you early on in your career, you were really charting a lot of the probably what we consider best practices, and even just the career of incident response, malware analysis, and reverse engineering. How did that formation take place while you were at Mandiant?
Yeah, it's definitely kind of a slow evolution. Well, maybe not that slow. Everything moved so fast in those early days that something that takes 2 years can feel like an eternity. But in the early Mandiant days, everybody on an IR team was to some degree a generalist, and everybody could do a little bit of forensics, could do a little bit of network analysis, but you generally had one person on the team that could do some malware analysis too. So that was kind of my role. I could show up and do disk forensics, and then once we found the malware, I could do the malware reversing, right there in the conference room. And that's how it all worked. We lived out of Marriott courtyards, and we operated out of corporate conference rooms. And but as things got more sophisticated and we started to develop these tools where we could collect data remotely, we could have more specialized people and do a lot more data kind of on the back end. So you could have like people who only did disk forensics and only did, remediation recommendations. And then it became possible for me and a couple of the other people on our team to just do nothing but malware. And we didn't have to live out of a courtyard Marriott, didn't have to rack up airline miles. We could just have people send us malware, and we do our best to look at that and get them the actionable intelligence as quickly as possible. And that kind of became the team concept between our original, what we called M Labs. It was the malware team. We ended up doing other projects once we decided to form that team and have that be all our main focus. There was a lot of time when there wasn't malware coming in, so we got to work on other projects, but we were still consultants. We were just like malware focused consultants. So for the first time, I fulfilled that like lifelong or, career long dream at that point of being a professional reverse engineer. Like my whole job, the focus of my job entirely is reverse engineering. And so that was pretty cool. Just one anecdote from the early M Labs period of time. It was very kind of dynamic environment at the Mandiant office. It was, we didn't have much office space, so we were stuffed like 3 people to a cube. And so it was very, when a new incident came in, you would know about it because literally you could just hear people talking about it, and you would, prairie dog your head up over the cubicle wall and be like, what's going on? What just came in? And you could just feel the dynamism in the office. It was very cool. But being in the malware team, I got a little taste of all the incidents as they came in. I could see some trends starting to happen. This is sort of around the time we founded like an intel analysis team and everything that would ultimately be responsible for these types of discoveries in the future. But one of the things I found was, it was kind of a cool find early, was I kept seeing malware samples come in with the same name, and it was ntshrewy.dll. And like, okay, this is kind of a weird name. And I see, but after like the 3rd or 4th sample with the same name, I realized that every time on one of these requests, the main thing they were asking for is, what is the persistence mechanism? We cannot find the persistence mechanism for this sample. And I was like, this is weird. They all have the same name. They're all asking the same question with like increased fervor. This is really weird. So I started looking into it, and that's when I realized what was going on with this name. And it was an application, I think it was explorer.exe, was intending, it naturally loads this ntshrewy.dll. Explorer.exe runs out of the Windows directory. ntshrewy.dll comes from the system32 directory. The malware was placed in the Windows directory. So because of the way the Windows loader works, it inadvertently loaded the malware version first, and then the malware could do its thing and then load the real version of ntshrewy later. And that's how the malware was gaining persistence. Just by placing the malware in a specific location with a specific name, they got persistence on the machine. So it didn't involve the registry at all, didn't involve any explicit file modifications on the system to inject code that would launch it or whatever. It just placed the malware in this location and it just works. So I documented that. I wrote a blog post about it, wrote a couple blog posts about it, where I tried to write a tool to try to audit this type of problem in the future. And I named it DLL search order hijacking. And that was the first documented form of this type of attack. About, I think it was a year later, some people documented some similar things that they were able to do from an offensive side, like planting files that an application would pick up as it traversed. I think it was like iTunes or something would pick up some DLLs and load them inadvertently. And, this started gaining steam. And so now this is a very common technique. It's probably the most visible security related thing that I've been a part of that I can claim credit for. If you look at the MITRE page for DLL search order hijacking, I'm the first documented reference to it. So even though clearly somebody else figured it out first because they wrote the malware to live in this location and they knew that this was a problem, but it was a very cool find at the time, and I got that find just by being visible and seeing all of the different requests that were coming in and seeing that pattern start to emerge. Nowadays, it's a lot more difficult. There's so much malware that comes in. It's you need some sort of automation that can try to see trends and things like that and have a whole threat analysis team actively looking for trends and whatever. But back in the day, it just came down to your friendly neighborhood malware reverse engineer just getting a hunch and following through.
And I think still to this day, maybe argue that the human in the loop is still a pretty vital component for this sort of analysis.
Yeah. And just a personal note here: if you what I'm describing, if you mention that as being DLL side loading, that is incorrect. Side loading was also discovered by FireEye, but it is a different mechanism. It involves modifying the manifest to get it to force a DLL to be loaded. So that's just one thing I want to get out there. It always bugs me that search order hijacking gets kind of renamed to side loading, because that is technically a different thing. Anyway, just coming off of my my high horse there. So I mentioned that the malware team, we looked at all the malware, but we had a bunch of people that were kind of formed the core of our team. Myself, Mike Sikorsky, Jay Smith, a few other folks. When we were not, doing malware or some other type of incident response type work, one thing Mandiant was big in from the very earliest days was education. So we would always were teaching classes. There was incident response classes, and malware was always very popular from the early days. So when I came to the company, there was, even though we didn't have a dedicated malware, team or anybody specifically that was a malware person, we had a malware course because it was something we encountered. I ended up rewriting that, so we had a new malware course, but our malware team was responsible for a series of malware courses, and I led the development of those and wrote roughly maybe half the content myself, so it was kind of under my clutch. And this series of malware courses became kind of the template for the book Practical Malware Analysis, which was written by Mike Sikorsky, who would eventually become our team lead. So Mike Sikorsky and his friend Tank, who I think at the time worked for Google. Well, Tank is his nickname. His name's Andy Honig. So they banged out the majority of this book. It was kind of patterned around the Mandiant courses, all new labs and everything. And they roped in a bunch of us Mandiant people to contribute to it. So I think Jay Smith, another guy, Lindsay Lack, and myself. So I contributed the anti-disassembly chapter. And this was a pretty cool feat because at the time, there was nothing published on anti-disassembly techniques. Later, after the book came out, there was academic work that was published. So some of the names that I called things were sort of renamed by the academic literature, but I think I do hold the moniker here of being first to market with some of these things. So how that came about was I had noticed some anti-disassembly, very crude anti-disassembly techniques in malware samples, and it kind of got my mind thinking, this is really cool. You can just craft a couple byte sequences in a certain way that throws off the disassembler. It's like, how far can we take this? So I had kind of done a lot of research and on my own and making these cool anti-disassembly, patterns and seeing how far what I could do to break IDA Pro and break other types of disassemblers. It was just a kind of a personal, interesting area of research for me. So it was a good fit.
So was it a combination then of your ingenuity as well as what you were seeing in the wild?
Yeah, the stuff I initially saw in the wild was just very simple, like one little byte pattern that would just throw off cool. The alignment of the disassembly really quickly. But it got my mind thinking, it's like, how far can you take this? Is there ability that, because all those times I encountered that, I was able to quickly write an easy script to undo it. But, would it be possible to, for example, make a sequence that you couldn't remove because it was important for the execution of the program, but it was also contained layers of code that execute, folded in on itself. So it couldn't be flattened and, had to exist. And, just how much of a nightmare can I create for an automated disassembler? So yeah, that was my personal research. So some of my personal research is in that, the module of our training course, which eventually got adapted into the chapter in the public into the practical malware analysis book. But now, like I said, yeah, it's a little bit more of a known academic topic.
Yeah, and it's for me personally, it's just as a really cool moment because the one of the Black Hat trainings that Mandiant offered early on, one of the malware analysis trainings, was one of my first, and of course PMA was probably where the rubber met the road for me in just learning malware analysis. So to now be able to sit here and talk with you and also call you a colleague is a very surreal and really cool moment.
Were you in my class?
No, I don't remember. I think the instructors were Jay Smith, Matt Graber.
Okay.
Those were the two people I remember. I think they were probably the most active at the time. I
Yeah.
also showed up to that class, probably like a lot of others, and it had been at least 10 years since I last looked at assembly. And so it was like a slap in the face because I did not prepare myself. And while maybe at the time it was a bit overwhelming, I still got a tremendous amount of value because it really set a roadmap for me and helped me identify where I want to be and of course what I need to learn to get there. So
Yeah.
All learning is good.
You also have that, I don't know, because you came in from a very academic kind of background. It's like, I face this too. Like you learn assembly in like an academic setting or from a book or whatever, and then the first time you open up a real compiled program, you have the sense of like, what on earth am I looking at? This is so much weirder than that book made it seem. Like I got an A in assembly class, the book made sense. What am I looking at here?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It was a world of difference. The compiler did what?
Yeah. Yeah. So the practical malware analysis book that came out around, what was it, 2012, I think, something like that. Very proud of it, and it kind of, the sense in your mind is like, oh, is this going to invalidate our training courses, or is this, people still going to want our training? And because it, for the low price of whatever it was, $39 or whatever, it contained a zero to hero level of malware analysis content with labs and everything. I think you would think like, oh, you had already made all this training material, it should be pretty easy to adapt into a book. But I think the hardest part was the lab. Like we wrote all new labs, and obviously all the material was like, we couldn't just plagiarize our original, so we had to like rewrite it from our personal time, sort of. But the hardest part was the walkthroughs of all the labs. So in our class, we spent a lot of time letting the students work and then going over the labs together so they can see where they went wrong. But in a book, you don't have the ability to just tell the students where they went wrong. So you have to walk them through it kind of keystroke and mouse stroke by mouse stroke at a time. So a good percentage of that book is just lab walkthroughs, and those were excruciating to develop. It's something I haven't done again since. We have, in our training material now, we have like detailed, quote unquote, detailed walkthroughs, but they're kind of not anywhere near the level of detail and thoroughness of those lab walkthroughs in the PMA book. And all of those have to be like, somebody else has to run through all of your keystrokes and, to verify them. And it was a real pain. I felt that whole process. I'm kind of glad I only wrote one chapter, but in hindsight of how monumental the book became, it's like, man, I wish I had written more chapters and been even bigger part of it. But it's glad to be. I'm glad it's out there. I'm glad, because we always had people, every time we teach these classes, people would ask us like, what's a great resource to continue learning, or what's where can I find this kind of material for somebody who can't take this class? And we're like, out of luck, there is no book. Like, so we're glad there's the book. And nowadays it's a little bit different. Like Josh, you have a great series of publicly accessible content. There's like plenty of open content out there that does a lot of similar things. So it's a bit more of a competitive landscape now. But when we first did this, it was the first of its kind that you could grab off the shelf at Barnes and Noble and teach yourself to be a malware reverse engineer.
Yeah, I was going to ask, because I mean, PMA has to be the first to have provided not only the theory, but such detailed lab guides. I mean, that was what stood out to me and has continued to this day as just a model for presenting content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was some books earlier, but it wasn't like they weren't malware focused. So I think when I first got into this, I picked up like, was it Reverse Engineering Code? I forget who the author was, Eldad Olam or something. I forget who wrote that book, but there's that book and a few other books that were like they had some disassembly content, but their focus was exploit analysis, and like it was always Linux focused, and but you could kind of piece together some of the concepts of like, oh, here this like loop or for statement looks like this in assembly code, and you can get these. You could piece together some of the stuff you want, but there was nothing out there that just like taught you the real discipline of malware analysis, which is obviously disassembly is important, but there's all the stuff that's not just disassembly that's equally as important and very vital to your advancement. So yeah, we're glad to have it out there, and like it's one of those rare times when you see this huge gaping market need for a book, and you can fill it and see it blossom and become celebrated.
Well, yeah, and it's still one of the go-tos to this day.
Yeah, it's definitely, it needs some updates, but like so many of the techniques are still relevant, and there's not many things else out there that are following that same kind of approach of like with the labs and the lab walkthroughs and being like a soup to nuts self-learning course in malware analysis of the topic. So it's a daunting task to take on. It's a little bit more fun to just write a book about your pet research project and like, here's some Python scripts and here's some stuff I'm working on, and I'll just call it malware analysis, but the painstaking, laborious process of training somebody from nothing to become a reverse engineer is a difficult and rewarding task in itself.
Yeah, sure. A blog post and a GitHub with a README that says read the docs.
Yeah. Yeah. So around that time, unfortunately, when PMA came out, I left Mandiant for CrowdStrike, and which now is going on to become a large, successful company on its own. So I was in there when it was like stealth mode startup. And while I was gone, so I guess I was away from Mandiant for about 3 years or so, and I came back. So in that time that I was gone, that was in the time when it sounds like you took our training class at Black Hat. And one of the important thing that happened while I was gone was one of the new people they had hired started this flare-on contest. And I was very excited. I didn't end up like, I played a couple of the stages, but I didn't like do the whole thing and get my name on the board or anything. But I thought it was a really cool idea. And it's actually like I had a similar idea for a reverse engineering contest while I was at Mandiant, and I submitted the idea off to DEF CON and never heard back from them. And I just kind of dropped it after that. So I was like, oh man, I left Mandiant and somebody, implemented that reverse engineering contest that I always dreamed of. So I was a little bit bummed. But then when I came back, the person that had started Flare-On had just left. So they were looking for somebody else to take over the Flare-On contest. And I was like, I'll do it. Sign me up. So I've actually been running that Flare-On contest ever since. If you're unfamiliar with it, it's a multi-stage, usually around 10 stages of reverse engineering challenges of progressing difficulty. So unlike other reverse engineering-ish challenges like DEF CON quals and things like that, the idea with Flare-On is that it's a kind of a single-player contest. You individually work through a series of challenges, and if you get to the end, you get your name on the Hall of Fame, you get a prize, whatever. But it's one of the few challenges out there that is kind of individually focused as opposed to group. One of the reasons it's impossible to enforce, like we can't really tell who's a group and who's individual, but the fact that you could only get one challenge at a time as opposed to unlocking like 5 challenges at once that kind of makes it an individual challenge, because a team doesn't have that much of an advantage over a single player. You can play with a team, but really the strongest reverse engineer on that team is going to be the player, and everybody else is going to be kind of along for the ride. Whereas like typical Jeopardy style CTF qualification games are, you need a large team because there's lots of different challenges to be worked on simultaneously, and you have to have different teams of people working on different things. So very cool. And it's a way to get like you can track your individual progression as you learn reverse engineering. It's a way to get like your name out there to the world as, hey, I'm a legit reverse engineer. I've solved flare-on for the last 5 years. It's interesting to see, since we've been doing this, when we get resumes, how many people list flare-on in their resume and how prominent their listing of their flare-on conquest is to their resume. So it's definitely, people see it as an important feather in their cap when job hunting. And part of the reason we started it was for recruiting, and to bring some glitz and glamour to the team. Say, hey, we do cool things, we work on cool stuff, we want the best. Here's our challenge. See if you're good enough for our team. That sort of thing. And it's worked amazingly. We've been able to track people from around the world and see them progress and identify these people. Like somebody on our team, I saw them finish. They finished fairly well, and we reached out to them, and they were like a freshman in college. And it's like, okay. Then next year they finished even better. It's like, well, they're a sophomore in college, and then they're a junior and finishing even better. And then by the time they're ready to look for an internship, they're one of the top finishers in flare-on, and we're able to reach out, get them in, and now they work for us and are doing great. And a pretty surprising number of our absolute top performers on our team come from being highly placed flare-on finishers. So it's can't like say everyone that's finished is work for us or whatever, but like generally the people who have finished high in flare-on have generally come with the skills to back up their reputation. So it's been very positive for us, and just people enjoy doing it. It's great to take a malware sample that does something cool. It's like, wow, how did they do that? And like spend some time like trying to implement that yourself and make it and have it work, and actually doing it the way the malware does, or even harder, and then unleashing that upon the world and seeing how people tackle that problem that stumped you. That being said, there's also there's some people at the absolute extreme end of the flare-on finishers, which are just terrifying human beings. I don't know how these people do what they do as fast as they do and almost effortlessly. One that comes to mind is he goes by the handle Lud. He's like the one who wrote, I think he wrote Spotify and a few other Scum VM. It's like one of these people has like a Wikipedia page just for their like programming accomplishments, and not a security person, but can crush reverse engineering as on a whim. It's just like it's just a little hobby to them, and they can just smoke everybody. So people like that can make you feel like you're a poser in the world. It's like, wow, like how can they just like do all that so quickly and effortlessly and like sleep and eat meals and still finish the whole flare-on in like 24 hours. So
yeah. And they're great. Like you publish solutions after the end of every flare-on. So we're correct. And there's a great educational resource for anyone who just wants to not necessarily compete, but to go through either during the competition or after and learn what they can.
Yeah, I wish this was around when I was just getting started. This would have been so fun, to like have little challenges and see, because the way we make it, where like everybody should, as long as you have a basic, you're like legitimately employed as a computer professional of any type, you should be able to solve the first challenge. It's basically a glorified CAPTCHA usually, to make sure you're a human being who can read and, click a button. But if you're like actively learning reverse engineering and security, like you should be able to maybe solve the second or third challenge as well. So you can chart your progress year by year, see how far you're getting. And it's not just like we're laying on the hard stuff right away. Sometimes we get the balance a little wrong, and there's like accidental, difficulty cliffs that come in too early, because like our internal quality assurance testing of that challenge like showed it to maybe be easier than the general public thought. So apologize for the years that's happened, but we do our best. But it's like it's not a perfect science to it.
Mm-hmm. So we're entering into the home stretch here. Any advice for those that are not only maybe learning reverse engineering and malware analysis for the first time, but even those that have been doing it for quite a while?
I think I will go into, it's kind of, everybody on Flare probably has the same advice. It's something like a mantra we repeat. But when you're first starting out, certainly as a reverse engineer, as a malware analyst, there's a tendency to just jump into disassembly. Like it's the part that drew you to this field. Like I said, like that's what I wanted to be. I just dreamed of combing through assembly listings as a job and getting paid for it. And there's this tendency to just drag you into that. But when people are like, you are depending on your work, and you're not just doing this as an academic exercise, or, you just want to make a really detailed blog post with lots of IDAPRO screenshots, but people are real time wanting, they're depending on you for malware analysis. They want actionable information. They want to know, what the sample is and what can I look for on my network and my hosts to find this as quickly as possible. The fastest way to get those answers is what's important, as opposed to solving it the way that you personally enjoy, and just jumping right into IDAPRO. So we force people, like when we teach them the training classes, and if you follow the PMA, rely on those basic techniques, the basic static analysis, basic dynamic analysis, deeply looking through your sandbox analysis and any other type of automated tooling you have, and get as much information out of that stuff as you can before jumping into IDAPRO. By the time you jump into your disassembly analysis, you should be pretty well informed about the malware and have an idea what information you need to get from that sample, and have a plan for it, as opposed to just randomly poking around. I think maybe an analogy would be like a mechanic. You're going to try to recreate the sound that you heard, or, see how it drives, whatever, so hook it up to a machine, run it, as opposed to just popping open the hood and start beating on things with a wrench. Maybe that's not a good analogy, because maybe I think I've had some mechanics that have done just that. But yeah, so the simple stuff seems like it might be below your level, or the thing you learned first, like, well, I'm past that now. I've learned I'm a great reverse engineer. I'm this brilliant computer scientist, but cheat, get those simple tools will get you the results quickly, and that is what's important. Rely on them, don't throw them away, and build on that form a strategy for how you move into the advanced analysis from there. So that's my whole strategy and approach, and what we sort of evangelize here on the Flare team.
I think that's absolutely great advice, and something that everyone should take a look at their workflow and their current path of learning, and make sure that they're keeping in mind. I think with that, Nick, I will wrap things up. Thank you for not only joining, but being the first guest of the podcast. It was a fantastic discussion. I learned a lot, and just really fascinated about all of the things your history and everything you've been able to be a part of. You truly are one of the pioneers of the field. And so it was just a great privilege to talk to you today.
Thanks for having me, Josh. This was a blast.
And that's all for this episode of Behind the Binary. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It really helps us to reach new listeners. Until then, stay curious and keep exploring.